9 o'clock. Hal, come on up on stage. Don't be bashful. Come on. Let's go. Why? Just count, okay? Just count? Yeah. You ready, Mort? 1.
Princeton University store.
Good evening, and welcome to our final evening in the series, Modern Architecture Los Angeles Beyond Neutra and Schindler, which has been presented under a grant from the Graham Foundation. We're delighted to have you all with us, and those of you who have been attending through some or all of these evenings know that we began looking at the architecture of Los Angeles in the 30s, came up through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and things that are going on right now, and we thought the only place to go is to the future. So tonight we're going to be talking about what might be coming in architecture in Los Angeles. May we have the lights? And I'll introduce our panel. Okay. We're looking at the work of our first guest, Charles Moore, who was born in Benton Harbor, Michigan.
Technology is not the future.
Wait a minute. Are we unplugged?
No, you're plugged in here.
Are we plugged at the projector?
I like it better like this. Huh? I like it better dark.
I don't know what to do.
It's sort of interesting.
Okay, slight delay while we check our connections.
Why don't we put on the lights?
Why?
So that you can check it. It's difficult to check it in the dark.
Ah, okay.
Did you do it?
I don't know, but we're in business again. Okay. Okay, we're continuing with the work of Charles Moore, who attended the University of Michigan, receiving his B.Arc there. Then he continued to study, worked for his MFA and PhD, was done at Princeton, where he also taught. He began his practice in 1955. He was chairman of architecture at Berkeley, 59 to 65, when he went to Yale to become chairman of architecture there, from 65 to 70, and then continued on teaching till 75. Last year he came here to UCLA to teach, and this year he is co-program head of architecture at UCLA. Our next guest is Frank Gehry. Frank was born in Toronto, Canada. He's a graduate of USC. And after 2 years in the Army, he studied city planning at Harvard. He worked with Victor Gruen and then went to Paris to work with André Raymondet for 1 year. Since 1962, he's been in his own practice here in Los Angeles. And he's been teaching at SCI-Arc for the past year. Our next guest is Helmut Schulitz, born in Germany. Started out as a mason and designed and built his first house before he studied architecture, which he studied at the Institute of Technology in Munich. He worked with Peter Polzig and Hassenflug in Munich and Berlin. In the European tradition, he entered many competitions, won 3 first prizes, which were not built, and then as part of a 3-man team, designed a hospital, which was built. Worked for the German government on industrialized system for university buildings. Received a traveling fellowship, which was matched by UCLA, and he came to study here for 2 years, 66 to 68. In 1969, he returned to begin his teaching at UCLA, and he's still part of the faculty there. He's recently completed a house in Coldwater Canyon, using some of his research ideas in industrialized systems. Our next guest is Peter de Brettville. Peter was born in San Francisco, attended schools in the East, studying architecture at Yale. He was the editor of Perspecta 67 publication. Worked for Peter Millard in New Haven, and then went to Italy and worked with Giancarlo De Carlo in Milano. That was 67 to 69. Shortly after forming the Works Partnership with Craig Hodgetts and Jean Cupper, they received a PA award for a mobile theater. The partnership was dissolved in '72. Peter has taught at UCLA and is now teaching at USC. And he's recently finished a pair of dwellings in Laurel Canyon and an elementary school in the valley. Our next guest is Roland Coate. Roland was born in California and is a second-generation architect. He's a graduate of Cornell University. And while in the East, he worked with Marcel Breuer and I.M. Pei. He began his practice in 1963. His Alexander House was recently featured in PA. He's been teaching at SCI-Arc for the past year and has also been working on some paintings that have been important to him in his recent development. Our next guest is Glen Small. Went to school at the University of Oregon and did his master's work at Cranbrook Academy of Art on an Eliel Saarinen Scholarship for graduate study. He's worked in architectural and planning offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Detroit, and had his own practice in Venice. Taught at Cal Poly Pomona from '69 to '72, and was a member of the founding faculty of SCI-Arc. He has lectured nationally and internationally on his mile-high megastructure concept, the biomorphic biosphere. thought we'd start out this evening giving each one of our guests a chance to express some particular ideas and then have kind of cross exchange. So Charles, would you like to start off?
Right. Am I hooked up?
Yes.
We're supposed to talk about the future, and it seems to me that the most exciting possibilities for the future come from the chance of having an enriched and stronger relation with the past. This is, I guess that's not really a very heavily argued point at this moment in time, but it was not long ago. I think because architecture is a traditional art, it has to be. It's understood by people in terms of things they have seen before and understand. When it all seemed to have fallen apart 100 years ago or up to 50 years ago, there appears to have been the expectation that that a set of right-thinking people could replace the confusion of the battle of styles and whatnot with some kind of new tradition, some modern architecture that would be a rallying point for society, would stop degradation and crime and war and make a new world. I don't think we're being either premature or overly harsh if we note by 1976 that didn't work, and that what seems to be the case after all is that people in the world, especially in a world closer and closer to some outrageous future, are more than ever interested in establishing connections with things they can orient themselves to, can find roots in, can feel at home with. So that I think at this point that what was wrong with the prescriptions of a half century ago, which may not have been wrong for a half century ago but seem wrong now, is that they depended entirely on sort of compositional arrangements, on clean new lines to make some sort of environment that would mean something to people. And in the 60s, we were treated to the kind of inverse of that expectation, in which it was supposed that personal interactions would provide that connection that would make buildings, the environment, mean something to people. It seems to me now that with neither of those things having been wrong, but neither of them having worked, that what the future might properly involve, and seems like it will, and I hope will, is a kind of choreography of on the part of architects designing, a kind of choreography of familiar and surprising things, in which buildings become interesting, very interesting to people by touching them, by having something to do with the bodies and the way they move in them, the way we move in them, and with our minds and our memories and how we relate to the buildings around us. It's not so simple. People are not so homogeneous as to make it possible to create a new tradition, it seems to me. But rather, I think it's not wrong to note that there are, for each of us, personal recollections and possible connections. That for instance, the sound of a motorboat across a lake. For each of us, personal recollections and possible connections. For instance, the sound of a motorboat across a lake in the summer might, for some of us, mean memories of pleasant childhood summers, and for other of us mean just another indication that the energy crisis is serious and the Arabs are getting our money. So there are personal ways people respond to things. There are cultural ways that people respond to things, so that in a time when people make buildings tall and pointy because that interests them, like it did in the 13th century, it's not long before they make their chair backs tall and pointy, and the little boxes on the table have tall and pointy lids, not because they have any structural need to do that, but because that seems like a very groovy shape to have. And then there are things common to all of us, that inherent in all our collective unconscious, that come, I suppose, from our standing upright and with our heads on top of our shoulders instead of hanging out in front like apes do it. And that special thing that makes a column, for instance, into a symbolic and powerful gesture, and not just a way of holding up the roof, is something shared by, I think, by humankind. And so, given personal and cultural and collective ways of comprehending, which are similar in the one, differ partly in another, and are altogether different in the third, it seems to me that some kind of massaging of the familiar and the surprising, that much more overtly and with open arms accepts the remarkable world around us and the stuff that's been here all the time, such of it as lasts, if we seize the chances hooked to that, makes for the possibility of a very rich and full future in the built world. End of statement.
Thank you, Charles.
Here you go.
Frank?
Am I plugged in?
Yes.
It's hard for me to talk about the future today. I just got back from the old country, and I'm still quite immersed in the past. I feel quite sympathetic to Charles' statement. I was trained, like many of you were, in an anti-Beaux-Arts atmosphere where the past was sort of denigrated, and the idea of being able to create a new kind of architecture was sold to us as a bill of goods. And I feel that I've had to go back on my own and re-educate myself to some of the values of the past and some of the works, the great works that have been created, and try to understand how they came about. I think that today there's a general questioning of our values. It's quite obvious that we've been pushed to the wall in many areas, and we have to look to different lifestyles. And in my work, I've been trying to search the simpler phenomena, natural phenomena, what natural light does, how to use surfaces and natural light to create a simpler sculptural space that needn't have all the paraphernalia that has become part of architecture. I've also been interested in exploring or questioning some of the aberrations that our society has created in the areas of lighting and furniture and building materials. And I see some work to be done and research to be done in those areas to find a new, well, not a new, but a restatement of this sort of simpler architecture, simpler architectural statements. Excuse me. I'm still on Greek time, which is 10 hours ahead, so I'm a little bit shaky. Why don't you go ahead?
Helmut?
For me, it is probably as difficult as it is for Frank to talk about the future, but not so much because I'm relating in the moment to the past, but more because I'm not so sure whether what Frank and Charles said is based on the right concept of the future in terms of whether it's possible for us at all to build in the future. If I look back, maybe I'm painting a very gloomy picture, but if I look back into the past and follow some of the trends that happened, especially in Europe and also in this country, you find that with a simple extrapolation of the past into the future, we may question whether we as architects have a good deal to plan for society and whether we are even able to deal with all those problems which we would like to deal with. Just looking back to what happened in the rebuilding of Europe, there was a tremendous rush after the war to rebuild the cities, and most of what happened was picked up by big corporations and mass-produce companies who were engaged in mass production, and the architects really didn't worry about it and weren't part of that whole game. And wherever one found out that those very simplified techniques of industrialization didn't work, they were expensive. In spite of all the subsidies of the government, they really didn't achieve any positive result. We find monotonous environments, very bad environments to live in. And one tried it many times with a so-called rationalized traditional approach, and which simply meant one cuts all the corners and builds the cheapest type of building. The first corner to cut was, of course, the architectural fee. One rubber stamped some buildings all over Europe. The architects again didn't get involved. He was so busy with every architect had still a lot of work to do, so nobody worried about the future. Up to, let's say, 2 years ago, and in a country like Germany, where one didn't know the word unemployment, suddenly one found that 50% of all architects are out of work. And one is now waking up thinking, now what happened? Is this the future? What will happen? Why did we lose why did we lose the connection? Why did it happen the way it happened? The only thing architects are involved now, to make it a little bit more black and white, is through the lobby of the architectural associations. They forced the government and cities to, whenever a federal building was in question, to organize a competition. And that's how the architects still pick up some of the volume. And the rest is to build for rich clients, not for the society, but for those people who simply can't afford the architectural fee. And in this big dilemma, what happens now, the architects don't know how to live, so they say the problem is our honorariums, which we get. Let's redefine that, and let's make the percentage we get a little bit higher so that we can again survive. nobody really knows where it's leading in the future. Now, in this country, we find that the masses of people are housed either in mobile homes or in dingbats or buildings which are built, again, without architects. And the architects engage in some aesthetic and some very elaborate considerations of how to please the clients who can afford it. And sometimes they are very happy to do the work for big corporations who need an image. And sometimes it's only the image is created by putting on a facade to a building. But they really were never engaged in, even in this country, in thinking of alternatives and how to take up their social responsibility in terms of planning really for society. We always talk about it, but we don't do very much about it. Now, in this country it's even more difficult because housing is not considered something which is created for people to live in, to again say it very black and white, just to create an argument here. It's not just something which is there for people to enjoy and to live. It's something which you think of as an economic commodity with which you speculate, which you resell, and all the publications which you find here, how to increase the value of your house, doesn't really help modern architecture. When it, for instance, one of the recent articles said, if you want to lose money on your investment, you hire an architect and do a modern design. If you want to make money with your house, you do some Spanish style or whatever the Bank of America or any other bank will finance. And so what we found suddenly that what we have in this country is a very homogeneous, very monotonous type of environment, considering that you would have all the options, all the potentials to really create an exciting environment here, because there's so much more freedom in terms of building and creating environments than in Europe. In Europe, people were happy to have a shelter or a roof on over their head, so they didn't care how that damn thing looked like. Everybody was happy to get shelter. But here, supply and demand was so much in balance that one could really search for new things and create a wider choice for the consumer. But it doesn't take place. And the trouble now from that gloomy picture, I don't like to deal with extrapolations. And so I think what we should be thinking more about is the future we like, and we should probably all work very hard to get that future we like, and not so much that one which can be read from the extrapolations of the past. And for me, the one way to get into that kind of future is to get more involved in those things which we didn't consider in the past. We always think of any new technology as the evil. We found out in one of the recent discussions that somebody brought up some of these bad monotonous environments in Holland as an example for industrialized building, where it's just a misapplied technology based on some very misunderstood concept of user involvement and so on in those cities. So what we have to find out how to get involved in all these new trends which are happening in order to get buildings going or housing going, which is not for the rich or not for the big corporations, but which is for the good of the total society.
Thank you, Helmut.
In order to get buildings going or housing going, which is not for the rich or not for the big corporations, but which is for the good of the total society.
Thank you, Helmut. Peter?
Talking about the future was a very popular thing in the 60s, and which was a time when I was in architecture school, and that led me into a project for a magazine which was very much dedicated towards defining new attitudes toward the future. And so when Shelly told me what the subject of tonight's panel was, I had to sort of go back at least that far to try and figure out what I thought about futures, because in the last several years, in spite of a number of magazines that are dedicated to such things, I find myself thinking I am more or less immersed in whatever the future is, and that whatever my concerns are somehow very immediate to me and have mostly to do with the future and not with the past, and not in the sense that there's a, and not at all in the sense that I think most people who talked about futures in the 60s meant that, which was biased, I think, toward a sort of Darwinian, sort of progressive idea of history and of the future, where somehow it was going to be remade, it was going to be extraordinary and totally new, and McLuhan in particular predicted futures which really were not possible to describe in conventional terms. And in my mind, a lot of that was a sort of playing out of the sort of aesthetic revolution of the 20s and 30s, and a kind of last gasp. And I feel like that was a kind of fortunate moment for me, because at the same time, a great many other attitudes were coming through the school I was at. And so I was forced really to be, I was in a sort of eclectic kind of transitional moment there. And so, and also, unlike Frank, my training was not immersed in the sort of heroic remaking of a new architecture, but rather was already very eclectic. And just in the period in which I was in architecture school, I went from Rudolph to Charles Moore, and you know, Sterling was through there, and Woods. I mean, you know, how do you make any sense out of that kind of combination of people? Well, I don't think I did. I mean, so what I've tried to do then, and this is somewhat anecdotal and fragmented maybe, is think about the kinds of things that I'm concerned about now, and see whether that suggests a way into, well, let's say into the future, or a way of making buildings now. One of the things that I was noticing the other day, and I was hanging around UCLA waiting for my wife to get done in the library and taking care of a 6-year-old kid, and he was kicking the football and riding his bicycle, and I was looking at all the buildings, and we were crossing like this, you know, whenever it was absolutely necessary. And what I was getting very intrigued by was how much I preferred to look at Royce Hall and the buildings in that huge quadrangle there, and that when we walked around, I got more and more depressed, you know, as I looked at sort of all the buildings since then, and it brought home once again the fact that we've really lost the way of making buildings which are really complex and rich, both in their form and in their surfaces and whatever. And only when I finally got all the way around, made a full circle, and walked by one of Frank Gehry's buildings there, did it sort of come back again, and our modern architecture sort of seemed okay for a moment, because there was a very plain building which seemed somehow very wonderful. But it made me still want to sort of say, well, can't we take a little bit of both of those and make architecture out of that? And that sort of connected up nicely for me with some other thoughts that I had about what people are doing about that. There's a lot of interest and a lot of talk about complexity, and I'm always talking about complexity with my students. And finally, the other day, somebody said, "Why do you keep talking about that? Why, you know, why complexity?" And I say, because it's nice. Everybody likes it. You know, it's wonderful to be in places that are complex and varied, and see and to walk around buildings that have intricate, complex surfaces of one sort or another. And it seems to me now that you can see kind of 2 or 3 camps that are sort of have a lot of interest in complexity and would claim it as their kind of special concern since Venturi. And I tried to sort of characterize those and figure out where I fitted into that, if at all. And it seemed to me that there was a lot of concern for, in particular, and a lot of talk about decoration, among other things, which modern architects aren't supposed to talk about at all. And I think I've identified 3 sort of areas there, and I'm dangerously close to being in one of them as far as I'm concerned. One of them is a complexity which is based on sort of popular culture and the sort of immediate environment or indigenous architecture or whatever, and this kind of comes full circle maybe to people who talk about junk architecture and cheap materials and things. And another one, place where you find very complex buildings and an impulse towards complexity, I think, is in architects like Richard Meyer, which make that complexity out of a sort of series of formal studies and formal elaborations. And the third, which is most evident in projects like Place Beaubourg, is what I wrote down as structural moralists. And these are the most perverse people, which is kind of funny in my mind, because they pretend to have a system of ornament, or they certainly are working with a system of ornament, which they feel compelled to explain in pragmatic or moralistic terms by trying to pretend that it's necessary to hold up the building. And in a lot of cases these days, you see a lot of structural gymnastics like that, of which that's simply not true. And this led me right back to my own work again, and to a whole discussion I had with myself about the two houses which were shown very briefly there, which had to do with, finally, I guess when you build something that you work on for 2 or 3 years, and it's the only thing you're doing except teaching, you look at it again and again, and you try and figure out finally what sort of definition you have made now that you've been through the whole thing. And one of my concerns in that building was, in the end, as it was being finished, was that it not be a simple building, that it not be a building which one could approach and say, oh, that is such and such a kind of building. And I thought a great deal about that, and it led to a lot of detailed decisions about how to paint it, and so on and so forth. But the main thing that seemed important to me there was that the building should be able to be understood or experienced or whatever in a variety of ways, so that depending on your mood or your particular attitude, you might leave that place describing it in entirely different terms than somebody with you in some other sort of frame of mind might use, so that you could see the building in many ways. And in that particular building, which had such an evident structure, my impulse was suddenly to paint it out, so that because the structure was so evident, it was not necessary to call attention to it. And in that way, you could call attention to the things that were not sort of as frontal and as immediate, which I think are really the real elements of architecture, which are the space and the light and the form which that structure encloses. The other source of complexity, which is at a sort of broader scale or larger scale, which has interested me, has to do with the contrast between things which are designed as a kind of open system in a kind of very generous way, as against things which are very particular and very fixed and very rigorously sort of tuned to whatever the particular function is. And that sort of contrast, that sort of interplay, and even conflict between those two ideas, if taken if taken not as a conflict, but as a means of responding to complex and very divergent issues, seems to me to be another way of achieving a kind of extraordinary complexity and getting away from the sort of idea that somehow everything has to be tight fit, simple, and plain, and pure.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh. Can everybody hear me? Peter uses the word complexity. The term that I was thinking of was diversity. Diversity was a word that kept coming up in the LA 12 thing last year, and it was very obvious that there was a great deal of diversity in the work, but I think that it's a term that I would like to talk about just a little bit, because I think that in the future, diversity is something that we're going to have to accept to a much greater extent than we are accepting it now in the world of architecture. I think it means that people from other disciplines are going to be moving into the architectural area, and I think that people in architecture are going to be moving into other areas of work. And I see in the crossover that takes place with that, or could take place, or is now taking place to a certain extent, a new excitement emerging in architecture, which is going to mean the relationship that an artist like Christo with his running fence in Northern California has to the environment, and has to architecture, and has to sculpture, and has to a kind of a magical illusionary quality, and any number of other layers of interpretation or feeling or involvement that you want to read into that particular event. It was also very much a media event. It was controversial. It galvanized the artistic world, and I talked to Henry Seldes, and who writes the art, is an art critic for the Times, and he told me that the matter was taken out of his hands, and it was a news release item, and that made him very angry that he was not able to comment on this. And I think that it's very interesting to see that Christo was so easily, by the multifaceted approach that he took to running fence, was able to transcend the critic and put the critic in a little different category for a change. And so I see that on Christo doing that on one hand, and then I see Bob Irwin with his scrim things that are getting very close to architectural environments. And I guess I could go down a list. You probably know them as well as I do, of the local artists who are really working with national audiences on things which are really verging and coming very close to architecture. And I think that, or really are architecture. And I think that Frank Gehry, with several of his buildings, I think in the Ron Davis house, where he works so closely with Davis, the relationship between the artist and the architect is extremely evident there, and very exciting and very appropriate. So I see that what I would term the crossing over of traditional boundaries as something that is beginning to happen, and I hope and I believe that it will continue to happen in the future, and will mean a real fertilization or refertilization of both architecture and fine art, and whatever other area that the crossover tends to take place in. I think specialization is breaking down. I think this is one of the things that's happening in the 70s. It's happening in science, and I think it's happening in the arts, that specialization is breaking down, and people are beginning to become involved in areas outside of their field. And when you see the results of what happens when somebody from one field moves in and starts getting creatively involved in another field, then I think you see some really exciting activity taking place. And again, I mean, you just have to read something like the Ascent of Man, or one of our recent works of, sort of bringing together the things that are happening in the art world and science, in the world of science and so on, to realize how much of this crossover is taking place. I don't think that the critics are really aware of it. I don't think that the architectural journalists are really that aware of it. But I think it's something that is happening to a certain extent because of the economic situation in Los Angeles. The art world, I believe, as far as I know, has pretty much fallen on its face. Certainly the architectural world leaves a lot to be desired. And I think that in this particular kind of a time, then people are having an opportunity to, without the pressure of the immediate kind of art exhibit and the kind of selling thing that goes on in the art world or in the architectural world, the immediate need to get buildings out and get them built, that there's a great deal more time to reflect. And probably everybody on this platform is teaching, and I think that's happening all across the country. And I think that in my teaching here at the school, I find the students fantastically involved in alternate energy sources and passive methods of designing buildings so that they properly utilize the environment and energy and so on. And I'm beginning to incorporate this into my own thinking and my own work, and I think that's an example of the crossover that's taking place. And I think that in the future, that this sense of diversity also might apply to the way we look at city planning. And I think that's a whole other area. I probably am taking up enough time, so I don't want to get too much into it, but I think that planning for not only the, what I would say, the obvious positive side of man, but also the accepting the negative and diverse side of man, or not to put those necessarily together, but it's a possibility that planning might begin to encompass more man's dark side, which I see as a positive thing, where we would begin providing places for people to go when they weren't so in such, wonderful frame of mind. Let's say that somebody feels in a violent frame of mind. Well, why not have an area of town which is like prepared for violence, and everything is made out of gray concrete, and all the street lights are like Edward Hopper paintings and that kind of thing, and when you go down there, you're looking for trouble, and you can usually find it. But when you come back, you've probably had all the violence you want for a while, and so what I'm saying is that diversity.
What if you don't come back?
And if you don't come back, that's your own problem. People might not come back. But we might find people not coming back.
That's what I meant.
But anyway, I think you all get the point. The point is that the future could hold more of an understanding of what human nature really is, rather than a kind of a falsification of what we idealize it to be. And I think that in the future there will be perhaps a more realistic approach to this in planning. That's just an aside. Okay.
I prepared a little speech this evening. My apologies for reading the notes, but when CBS comes next time, we'll use cue cards. At dinner tonight, there was sort of a swank Chinese restaurant. The most notable thing that happened was Kareem Jabbar came by and a big shadow fell across the table. But we had at the end, we had these fortune cookies, which everybody relates to, and I just want to convey to you my fortune. You have a natural grace and great consideration for others. I'm very happy to be here and to see such a large captive audience. I love it. I love it. Take note, everyone, at this point, I am starting on an upbeat. From now on, watch on with the show. I'm not here to endear myself to the audience, panel, nor Shelley. So I'll be quite candid this evening. For those that have been suckered in here on the pretense that we have a panel of concerned architects about the future, let me introduce the panel. We have Charles Moore, the polite, eclectic, shed-roof joker. A well-mannered Venturi. Then we have Frank Gehry, a man about town, hustler and opportunist, usually with a gimmick. One of his quotes at dinner was, he said, "I don't care about the future." Helmut Schulitz and Peter de Brettville, a couple of guys who just discovered steel construction 20 to 30 years after the fact. Roland Coate, the custom freeway builder. $750,000 per 100 feet.
Cheaper than a real freeway. Cheaper than a real freeway.
All these guys are good guys. And they're but they can hardly seriously be considered to talk about the future. Really, this must be a joke. What we're qualified to talk about as a group is the professional practice today supported by teaching incomes. I believe architects break down into groups. The first group, the nuts and bolts people, visor hats, sip cokes, play cards at noon. And then there's the second group, the hustler implementers. Get it built, sell it, what is it? Who cares? As long as we can detail it nicely. What are those gas jets in the ceiling for? Who are we to question? The client paid for them. The building department stamped the drawings. It's a defense job. Then there's a third group, very, very minor group. There must be a better way. And I won't buy the present values, so I'll push for major change. I believe the public high school stuff of do your best, listen to your conscience. Each group has its place, and the emphasis fluctuates in this season, out next season. I can't really get mad at this panel. They do their job. In 20 years, if the biomorphic biosphere were in, they would design and build it. They build the fads. For those that are unfamiliar with my work, I'd like to go into it at this moment. Shelly said we could talk as long as we wanted to. Okay, the project's called the biomorphic biosphere. Biomorphic means natural shapes, and biosphere means a layer of air around the Earth that supports life. I worked on the project for about 10 years, fluctuating in and out of the real world of architecture. I consider my work in the present. I can't project the technology that the future will bring. Most people categorize it in a fantasy world, but I feel it's here and now, and if we channeled our minds and energies, we could develop in this direction. It returns LA Basin to a high water table that supports grasslands, abundant animals, estuaries, rivers, wilderness, agriculture, parks, and historical sites. It collects its own water, grows its own food, recycles waste, uses natural forms of power, and is an exciting, groovy, gigantic, naturally vented greenhouse funhouse with movable living units that can be transported to the land or another city. It grows itself or eats itself depending on the needs. It's a cross-section of nature and technology, biomorphic biosphere, rah, rah, rah.
He's got that down there, too.
Got it all here. I'm available for lectures and patrons. What do? I do drawings, models. I wrote a feature script on a movie about it last year that no one has bought. If somebody wants interested, it's available. I have exhibits, give lectures, sit on panels, do TV and radio shows, presently I'm making a Super 8 film on the biomorphic biosphere with Ralph Mercena, a student here. And what does this all mean? It means, basically, I'm an educator. I don't believe in building known ecological and social mistakes. I'm not pure by any means. I have contributed my share to raping the earth. In my brief period of 2 years as having my own practice, I built 83 units in one house. I have sinned. I hate myself for it. And I will try to improve and try to improve. This series was good in the fact that it reviewed history of LA through the so-called second-string hotshots. I have always contended if you squint your eyes on the details, most buildings, they all look alike. Pretty similar third and fourth rate structures. I think basically it was touched on by Roland, but the urban texture is the thing that really sort of counts. Not the building here or nor the one 2 miles that way and the one 5 miles that way. They're all architectural monuments and pieces of art. What interests me is that for some minor utterances during this series, I don't hear the panel, well, I didn't hear the panel chaired by Ray and orchestrated by Bernard, but no one has spoken or dealt with building with ecological systems. The U.S. is the model for the world building. If we make mistakes, it is compounded tenfold in underdeveloped nations. And by recent census of people living in U.S. cities, 9 out of 10 want to move to small towns and rural situations. René Debow speaks of the need for the fragrance of a flower, the tweeter of a bird, the view of infinity. If 6% of the world's population is using 60% of the world's resources in utter destructive rape, what happens when the underdeveloped countries that constitute 86% of the population growth in the world want the same consumerism goodies that pollute our nation? They do, you know. But beyond all this ecological death threat, what about the sensuality of groovy environments? Now really, raised in these plaster disaster hard-edged boxes with 8x8 balconies screws one up. How to implement these concerns? The educational process of telling people high and low that the food they eat, the new high-rise buildings, suburban tracts can be a lot better if you get back to the basics. And I think using the media can be very influential. Architects know what to do with this. That's the way they get a lot of their jobs. I doubt if the good guy architect has the stomach for this. Even though they could probably become qualified easier than most professionals because they are accustomed to organizing and synthesizing large complex problems and are not afraid of aesthetic judgment. I think we should be educating students and public to stand up for their ideals and implement them. What's in store for the future? I feel a sort of a wishy-washy service profession that now exists barely